In this series of videos, I want to look at a very famous essay, published in 1937 by the Frankfurt school theorist Max Horkheimer. And it is called Traditional and Critical Theory. It sometimes is said to be kind of the manifesto of the Frankfurt School. Fine. It's a very interesting paper, and I think it's well worth reading because the ideas that it contains are very influential today, because a lot of people do claim to be doing critical theory. So it's like all kinds of things that are critical theory go off in all different kinds of directions. But the notion of kind of critical theory, as I talked about in a series of videos on Eagleton's book, Ideology, critical theory, splits up into a lot of different sort of theories. So critical theory, when it's written like with a capital C and a capital T, critical theory, it's largely coming from Horkheimer and the gang through the Frankfurt School. And then there's critical theory with the small c, small t. You have various kinds of queer theory and decolonial theory, all kinds, critical race theory, are all basically different versions of, I wouldn't say different versions of this, but definitely influenced by this. And of course, those kinds of theories are all over the place today. They're being taught everywhere and talked about, and pretty controversial too, as well. So, if something's pretty well available and is taught a lot and is controversial, let's go and look at where a lot of the ideas come from. I think in order to get a really good idea of where all this stuff comes from, one would have to study Marx quite a bit, because a lot of these thinkers are heavily influenced by Marx. And then, of course, to really understand Marx, you've got to understand quite a bit of Hegel. And then, of course, understanding Hegel, you'd have to understand quite a bit of Kant and what he's reacting to. And guess what? Kant is reacting to Hume. Anyways, we can't do it all. So let's just look at this paper. Very interesting and influential, and that'll have to do for now. Okay, so not surprisingly, let's look at the title, Traditional and Critical Theory. So it's not surprising that he's pushing what he thinks is a new thing, critical theory, but he's looking at traditional theory. And that's his first question, what's traditional theory? But he basically says, what do we think of when we typically think of theory? Oh, that's a theory. You have a particular theory. Well, I think that it's pretty safe to say that, we hear terms like evolutionary theory, the theory of special relativity, the theory of general relativity theory, the theory of quantum mechanics, chemistry, chemical theories. They tend to be associated with the sciences. Well, Horkheimer is saying, yeah, that's largely where they come from. So let's start there. And he does refer to some scientists of the time, the great Henri Poincaré. It makes an appearance there, so you can have a look at what Poincaré. I'm not going to talk about that. Also, Hermann Weyl, a contemporary of Einstein, a major contributor to the philosophical foundations and mathematical structures that are connected to general relativity. A major thinker also in quantum mechanics, this application of group theory dynamics to quantum systems. Okay, so so needless to say, it's all connected. The traditional theory is connected to science. It goes back even further. It's deeply connected to math and the history of math. But what is it basically? Well, connected to natural science, it's basically a structure, a system of related propositions, right? Moving towards a very symbolic, abstract way of being recorded. So you have various propositions, and they're divided. Some are what are kind of your base propositions, and the others are inferred. So this little line here is from your base propositions, you infer other propositions. So this collection of propositions is actually organized. It's not haphazard, right? So you can ask the question like, where do the base propositions come from? Where do the inferred ones come from? Well, inferred one from the base. Okay, now where do the base propositions come from? Well, the base propositions are arrived at in various ways. And Horkheimer goes through this. So how does he do it? He said, well, different thinkers from John Stuart Mill to Edmund Husserl have taken slightly different views of theory in the sense that they have different ways of approaching the base propositions. Some philosophers may disagree. Like Mill, they're based on experience. They're generalizations of experience. Husserl has a more mathematical type of approach, a particular mathematical type of approach, and he thinks that those base propositions are ultimately rooted in a special kind of evidence, a special kind of insight that we have. Yeah, kind of sort of like a Platonic notion of you can grasp, the mind can grasp truth. So you can have an empirical way, kind of a la Mill, where you look at and you make generalizations. You can have a sort of a quasi-Platonic kind of way in Husserl, where you can grasp certain kinds of truth. Those are your base propositions. You could also have another way, kind of the axiomatic way that Horkheimer talks about, where base propositions, they're not really generalizations from experience, and don't get all excited about the mind having some special insight. Rather, they're just sort of postulated. Kind of like Euclid, right? When he postulated things. Yeah, they sort of are experiential in the same of, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line and things like that. And then the Euclid's fifth postulate, which you can look that up, which is not very intuitive and was the problematic one. And when people changed it, it led to the discovery of different kinds of geometries. But the system of Euclid, was largely a set of axioms that they're kind of just postulates, right? We don't prove them. We don't worry about where they come from. We just assert them, right? And you also find this in science. Einstein framed the special theory of relativity in terms of postulates, right? He's going to lay down a postulate, like I'm not going to talk about where the speed of light, how we know, or blah, blah. We're just going to assert it to be a constant. Right? And then we're going to use that as a postulate and build on that and see what we get. And that led to all kinds of very counterintuitive results based on arguably kind of a semi-counterintuitive notion that the speed of light is the same everywhere. But he lays it down as a postulate. Fine. All this is to say that your base propositions can be arrived at in various ways. So have a look. He talks about all these different ways. But they all come to agreement is once you've got them, then logic takes over. You make inferences, and once you've got them, you make inferences. You build up your propositions, and once you're building up this structure, you're trying to make it as very abstract as much as you can, so you can run the logic on it, and then you will get these inferred propositions. You go out and you check them. You be a good little scientist, and you run out to the world and you say, well, I've got these counterintuitive propositions, kind of a la Einstein. And this is a big simplification of the scientific process, but you then grind out all these kinds of things, and then you can go and you look at see if the world is actually like that. And sure enough, with Einstein stuff, a lot of these counterintuitive things, they started to observe, yeah, hey, that's how nature really is. Now, does that make it for sure that these base propositions are true? No. But it certainly lends them quite a bit of support. If they have a lot of explanatory power and they make good predictions and all that, people get more and more comfortable, and then they stop worrying too much about the truth, and they just say, hey, the theory covers a lot of the empirical phenomena, and you're off to the races. So basically, there might be some quibbles about certain things, maybe exactly how you make the inferences, how you get the base propositions, maybe some quibbles about, how well they line up here or whatever. But the overall picture, right? This is the traditional notion of theory, and the natural sciences kind of say, yeah, that's our baby. This is how we do it, right? Okay, so theory as this, let's call it this system, right? This logical kind of system, this abstract mathematized kind of system of propositions. What about the sciences of man and the sciences of society? What we might today call the social sciences. Don't get too worried about the terminology. But he looks at, Horkheimer says, what about other disciplines that are outside of the natural sciences? He goes off, and here's where some of his views start creeping in. It's good the sciences are awfully successful, and they tend to get funding, So let's look at their methodology and then use that and then apply it to other domains that are not traditionally associated with natural science. So now I'm going to look at things in, maybe psychology. I'm going to look at it from us and use this system, right? Use this approach to theory. I'm going to look at sociological questions, and I'm going to do it this way. Instead of doing political philosophy or whatever, I'm going to do political science, and I'm going to put forward hypotheses. I'm going to try and put forward axioms and derive. That's another thing, is that the whole system is regarded as a giant hypothesis to be checked against experience. That's another way of viewing this. And so instead of doing political philosophy, where I worry about all kinds of things that may be very hard to test, I stick to things about politics that can be tested. And so and I try to come up with some kind of set of axioms for politics. I come up with inferred propositions, and then I go out and test them against reality and things like that. And voila, you get a kind of political science as opposed to political philosophy. So theory in this way, it becomes, shall we say, used by people who are not doing the natural sciences, but they're doing their thing as if it were a natural science by embracing theory. And he says, there's not a surprise that this thing is all linked up. He gives you some foreshadowing. All this is linked up with sort of the bourgeois marketplace, and all this, so money is involved, and social structures are involved. You can see where he's going with this, that he's going to link this to, this doesn't blow out of a vacuum. This is historically constituted, even though it comes out in the end as very abstract. So think of it along the lines of, in the way that geometry, like non-Euclidean geometry is extremely abstract. You don't really see it in everyday life, but it's highly useful in theories. But in the end, geometry originally, if you look at it etymologically, the term geometry is kind of like, roughly measure of the earth, right? And it comes out of early geometric investigations were about measuring the earth in order to build buildings. So very historical and very concrete origins of something that became extremely abstract. And this abstraction, if you just look at it in math texts, you think this has got nothing to do with experience. Well, historically, it did. Okay. So in the sciences of man and the sciences of society, there might be disagreement, like there is up here in various ways, about finding the base propositions. You might have more empirically minded sociologists who think, yeah, we got to go through the data sets and all that and drive and try and get empirically grounded propositions. You might have more phenomenologically minded, thinkers in sociology. Same thing that you have up here. Yeah, there might be disagreement on how to ground the base propositions, no problem. But in the end, this basic structure is their basic view of theory as well. Okay, what about history? How does this traditional theory, again, right? How does this traditional theory handle questions regarding history? And here Horkheimer refers to a debate. I'm not going to actually be that accurate, historically accurate in my discussion here. Just want to give you the flavor of what Horkheimer is taking away from this. So he refers to the Meyer-Weber debate. Meyer is a historian. Weber is a sociologist. Now, they didn't actually debate this, but it was debating a historical counterfactual. And so I just use this one because everyone's heard this. Something like this. Here's a counterfactual. If Hitler didn't exist ever, right, would World War II have happened, right? If Napoleon hadn't have existed, would France have done what it did in the 19th century, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so it's a counterfactual. It's counter to fact, because Hitler did exist and so did Napoleon. But if we say, well, if they didn't, what would have happened? And people, like some people might say, oh, well, if Napoleon hadn't existed or Hitler hadn't existed, different stuff would have happened, right? Or you might say something like, no. Even if those guys hadn't have existed, very similar, almost identical things would have happened. And you would come up with a way to explain your link between the existence, non-existence of these characters, of these historical figures, and historical results. So you'd be making judgments about them. You'd say, well, we could reason in this way about these people if they existed, if they didn't, and to when they existed, this happened, and when they didn't exist, we can conjecture that this might have happened. And that's what Weber does. Weber constructs sort of a theory, so let's call it Weber's theory of history, WTH, of sort of this objective possibility. Yeah, we can make sense of this. And so this counterfactual can be answered. So he's like, yep, it's answerable. Whereas Myers said, nah, this isn't even answerable. This is abstract notion. Historians typically, although historians tend to be changing these days, historians typically did not like dealing with counterfactuals, and they did not pardon the pun. Historically, historians never did like really dealing with, how the past should be used as a kind of judgment for what's going to happen. Historians today tend to do more of that, but like classically, historians were very leery of saying, yes, I studied the past, so therefore talk to me about what's going to happen. Historians used to be very, didn't even like talking about counterfactuals of the past, and certainly did not deal in predictions. They didn't have theories like that. They didn't see history as something like something that you can really look at and deeply learn from in order to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. They didn't have theoretical structures like that. So that notion of history becoming something that you can theorize, conceptualize in this framework, develop a theory, then answer counterfactual questions, then go into podcasts and things like that, and give predictions as a historian. That's a particular view of the theory that is used to construct what would be his quote-unquote historical knowledge. Okay, so what's going on now? Well, Horkheimer's key point seems to be something like this. What we can take away from Weber's theory of history is the response to a very particular question, right? This one here, is that his theory of history is a response to a particular question, a particular task. Okay, so that's sort of the isolated question. Is where does that theory of history come from? Well, it's in response to a very particular question, a counterfactual question. Okay, if that's the case, then theory construction, right, doesn't just blow out of a vacuum. Theory construction, not just what's in the theory, but the very nature of the way theory is constructed, right, in this traditional model, is linked to the tasks at hand. So why does theory get constructed? Look at what the tasks at hand are. Why does theory get constructed in that way? Look to the tasks at hand. That's a key point that Weber is trying, I think, to make here. So when you generalize this, what scientists think is the essence of theory, right, the very nature, the deep nature of theory, is in fact something that corresponds to the immediate tasks that they set for themselves. Okay, so what he's trying to show is that this whole notion, the asterisk thing, is a historical contingency. It doesn't just blow out of a vacuum. It's not an essence of theory. It's something that is historically constructed. Now, he's going to look at this in a little more detail, and he's trying to drive home this point that that this notion of theory is contingent, and even though it comes in the end, it looks in this mathematically conceptualized abstract framework, it nonetheless is a very concrete historical object and shouldn't be taken as some kind of essence of theory. And if that's the case, that opens up the possibility that theory could be seen and understood in different ways rather than just this traditional one. Hence, he's creating the possibility of opening up the reader and, conceptually to the notion of, well, there could be a different way of thinking about theory. And that's what he's going to try and push in this essay. But he's not quite done with showing this as something that's historically constituted. But again, run out of board space. See you next video.